The rain hammered against the windshield as I pulled into the parking lot of Sunset Manor Nursing Home in Springfield, Illinois. The gray November sky seemed to mirror the heaviness in my chest as I helped my grandmother, Rose, out of the passenger seat. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped my arm, a symptom of the Parkinson's disease that had been slowly stealing pieces of her independence over the past 2 years. "I don't want to be a burden anymore, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of raindrops pelting the pavement. At 82, Rose still carried herself with dignity, but I could see the fear in her cloudy blue eyes as she stared at the beige brick building that would become her new home. "You could never be a burden, Grandma," I replied, though the words felt hollow. The truth was, I couldn't take care of her anymore. Between my demanding job as a marketing coordinator and my own family responsibilities, I was drowning. Mom had passed away 3 years ago, and Dad lived across the country in California, consumed by his own battles with his health. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical whoosh, and we were greeted by the sterile scent of disinfectant mixed with something I couldn't quite identify, maybe resignation, maybe lost hope. The lobby was decorated with artificial flowers and motivational posters that felt more depressing than uplifting. A few elderly residents sat scattered around the common area, some dozing in wheelchairs, others staring blankly at a television that was turned up too loud. "Welcome to Sunset Manor," chirped a young woman behind the front desk. Her name tag read Jessica in cheerful pink letters that seemed to mock the somber atmosphere. She couldn't have been older than 25, with perfectly straight blonde hair and a smile that looked practiced rather than genuine. "You must be Rose Mitchell. We're so excited to have you join our family here." Family. The word stung because I knew this place would never feel like family to my grandmother. As we completed the paperwork, I noticed how Jessica's eyes lingered on Rose's shaking hands when she tried to sign the documents. My grandmother had to grip the pen with both hands, concentrating intensely to form each letter of her signature. The tremor made her handwriting look like that of a child just learning to write. "Oh my, those hands are quite shaky, aren't they?" Jessica commented with false sympathy, her voice carrying just loud enough for nearby staff members to hear. "Don't worry, honey. We'll take good care of you. We have activities for residents with limitations." I felt my jaw clench. Rose's cheeks flushed pink with embarrassment, and she pulled her hands into her lap, hiding them beneath the folds of her wool coat. This woman had no idea who my grandmother was, what she had accomplished in her life, or the grace with which she was facing this terrible disease. A tall man in scrubs approached us, his badge identifying him as Todd, a nurse's aide. He had the kind of muscular build that suggested he spent his free time at the gym, and there was something in his manner that immediately put me on edge, a casual arrogance that made my skin crawl. "I'll show you to your room, Rose," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. He grabbed the handles of her wheelchair without asking if she needed it, essentially forcing her to sit down. "Hope you're not expecting the Ritz-Carlton. This is a nursing home, not a resort." As we made our way down the long corridor lined with faded photographs of residents and their families, I heard Todd making comments to another aide walking beside us, a woman named Patricia who seemed to hang on his every word. "Another one with the shakes," Todd muttered, loud enough for us to hear. "Bet she can't even hold a coffee cup without spilling it everywhere. These Parkinson's patients are always making messes." Patricia giggled uncomfortably. "At least she's not combative like some of them get." Rose's shoulders sagged, and I saw her hands tremble even more violently in her lap. She was trying so hard to maintain her composure, but I could see the hurt etched in every line of her weathered face. This woman, who had raised me when my parents were struggling, who had taught me to read and ride a bike, who had been my safe harbor through every storm of my childhood, was being reduced to nothing more than a symptom, an inconvenience, a set of shaking hands. Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a single window that looked out onto the parking lot. The previous occupant had left behind an artificial plant covered in dust and a cross-stitch sampler that read, "Home Sweet Home," in faded blue thread. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "The bathroom is right through there," Todd said, gesturing dismissively toward a door. "Dinner's at 5:30 sharp. Don't be late, or you'll miss it. We don't do room service here." He laughed at his own joke, while Patricia smirked beside him. As I helped Rose unpack her few belongings, I tried to make conversation about the positive aspects of the place, the activities calendar posted on her door, the garden she could see from the window, the library cart that made weekly rounds. But we both knew I was grasping at straws, trying to make this transition easier for both of us. "There's a piano in the common room," I mentioned, remembering the old upright I had glimpsed near the television area. "Maybe you could." "No, sweetheart," Rose interrupted gently, holding up her trembling hands. "Those days are behind me now. These old fingers aren't good for much of anything anymore." The resignation in her voice broke my heart. My grandmother had been a gifted pianist in her younger years, playing for the church choir, accompanying the local high school musicals, and filling our family gatherings with beautiful music that seemed to make everything brighter. She had tried to teach me when I was young, but I had been too impatient, too eager to be outside playing with friends to appreciate the gift she was trying to share. That evening, as I prepared to leave her there, Rose gripped my hand with both of hers. Despite the tremor, her grip was surprisingly strong, and her eyes were clear and determined. "Promise me something," she said. "Promise me you won't let them break my spirit. I may be old, and I may shake, but I'm still me inside. I'm still the woman who raised you, who loved you, who believes in you. Don't let them forget that." Tears stung my eyes as I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "I promise, Grandma. I love you." As I drove home through the darkness, the rain still falling steadily, I couldn't shake the image of my grandmother sitting alone in that sterile room, her hands folded in her lap, trying to hide the tremor that had become her unwanted companion. I had no idea that within days, she would find a way to remind everyone exactly who Rose Mitchell really was, and that her shaking hands would become the very instruments of her redemption. The next morning, I called the nursing home to check on her, and Jessica answered the phone with her perpetually cheerful tone. "Oh, she's adjusting just fine," Jessica assured me, though something in her voice suggested otherwise. "She's been spending time in the common room, mostly just sitting and watching television with the other residents. Very quiet, very compliant." Compliant. The word made my stomach turn. My grandmother had never been compliant in her life. She had been strong-willed, passionate, full of life and opinions and dreams. If she was being compliant now, it meant they were already breaking her spirit just 3 days into her stay at Sunset Manor. I decided I would visit her that weekend, bring her some of her favorite chocolate chip cookies, and maybe some photographs to brighten up her room. I had no way of knowing that by then, everything would have changed, and the entire staff of Sunset Manor would see my grandmother in a completely different light. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, with that particular bite in the air that promised winter was just around the corner in central Illinois. I had spent the night before baking Rose's favorite chocolate chip cookies, using her own recipe that I had watched her make countless times throughout my childhood. The familiar ritual of measuring flour and vanilla, the sweet smell of butter and brown sugar, it all made me feel closer to her, even though she was miles away in that sterile building. As I pulled into the parking lot of Sunset Manor, I noticed more cars than usual. A sign by the entrance advertised, "Family Visiting Day Music and Refreshments in the Common Room, 2 p.m. I glanced at my watch, 1:45. Perfect timing, I thought. Maybe Rose would enjoy being around other families, hearing some music, feeling less isolated. The moment I stepped through those automatic doors, however, I knew something was wrong. The atmosphere felt tense, charged with an uncomfortable energy that made my skin prickle. Jessica was behind the desk as usual, but her cheerful demeanor seemed forced, strained around the edges. "Oh, you're here to see Rose," she said when she spotted me. She's been having a difficult morning. You might want to prepare yourself." Before I could ask what she meant, I heard raised voices coming from the direction of the dining area. I followed the sound, my heart rate accelerating with each step, until I found myself standing in the doorway of a scene that made my blood boil. Rose was sitting at a round table, trying to eat her lunch, but her hands were shaking so violently that she could barely get the spoon to her mouth. Soup dripped down the front of her cardigan, and there were crackers scattered across the table where she had tried and failed to open the packaging. Standing beside her table were Todd and Patricia, along with another aide I hadn't met before, a heavy-set woman with graying hair whose name tag identified her as Margaret. "Look at this mess," Todd was saying, his voice dripping with disgust. "It's like feeding a toddler. How are we supposed to keep this place clean when she's spilling food everywhere? Patricia was holding a towel, but instead of helping, she was just standing there shaking her head. My 3-year-old nephew has better motor control than this. Maybe she needs to go to the memory care unit where they feed the residents. Rose's face was flushed with humiliation, but I could see her trying to maintain her dignity, attempting to clean up the mess with trembling hands that only made things worse. Other residents at nearby tables were staring, some with sympathy, others with the kind of morbid fascination people have when watching someone else's misfortune. That's when Margaret decided to add her own commentary to the situation. Honestly, I don't understand why families dump their relatives here when they're this far gone, she said, loud enough for the entire dining room to hear. Look at those hands, she can't do anything for herself. She can't eat, can't write, probably can't even button her own clothes. What's the point of keeping someone around when they're nothing but dead weight? Dead weight. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I could see they hit Rose even harder. Her hand stopped moving entirely, and she looked up at Margaret with tears gathering in her eyes. In that moment, I saw something inside my grandmother break, not her spirit, but something deeper, more fundamental. It was the moment when she began to believe what they were saying about her. I was about to storm over there and give them a piece of my mind when an elderly man at the next table spoke up. His name was Frank, according to the placard on his walker, and he had the weathered look of someone who had worked with his hands his entire life. "That's enough," Frank said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect for decades. "Rose is a human being, not a burden. Show some compassion." Todd turned his attention to Frank with a sneer. "Mind your own business, old man. We're the professionals here. We know how to handle residents with limitations." "Limitations," Frank repeated, his voice rising. "That woman has more grace and dignity in her little finger than the 3 of you combined. Just because her hands shake doesn't mean she's worthless." But the damage was already done. Rose had heard enough. She pushed back from the table with tremendous effort, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor, and began to make her way slowly toward the exit. Her head was held high, but I could see the tears she was trying so hard not to shed. I intercepted her in the hallway, and when she saw me, the dam finally burst. She collapsed into my arms, sobbing with the kind of deep, wrenching grief that comes from having your dignity stripped away in public. "They're right," she whispered against my shoulder. "I am useless. I can't do anything anymore. These hands, they're not my hands. They don't obey me. I'm not the woman I used to be." "That's not true, Grandma," I said fiercely, holding her as tightly as I dared without hurting her fragile frame. "You are exactly the woman you've always been. You're kind, intelligent, talented, loving. A medical condition doesn't define who you are." But she pulled away from me, shaking her head. "Look at me. Really look at me. I can't even feed myself without making a mess. I can't write my own name legibly. I can't," she held up her hands, watching them tremble uncontrollably. "I can't even hold a coffee cup steady. How can I be anything more than a burden?" We made our way to her room, where she sat heavily on the edge of her narrow bed. The afternoon light filtering through the window cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting every line, every sign of the exhaustion that seemed to permeate her very bones. "I keep thinking about the piano," she said suddenly, her voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her. "Do you remember how I used to play for you when you were little? You would sit beside me on the bench, and I would teach you chopsticks, and Mary had a little lamb." I remembered. I remembered more than that. I remembered the way her face would light up when she played, how her entire body would come alive with the music, how she could make that old piano in our living room sound like it belonged in Carnegie Hall. "You were magical when you played," I told her honestly. "It was like the music just flowed through you." She looked down at her hands again, and I saw something shift in her expression, not quite hope, but maybe a flicker of longing. I know I couldn't really play anymore, but I wonder if I could still remember the songs. If my hands could still find the keys, even if they shake. "There's a piano in the common room," I said carefully, not wanting to push too hard but sensing an opportunity. "Maybe we could try, just for a few minutes. Just to see." She shook her head immediately. "Oh no, I couldn't. Not in front of everyone. Not with these hands. They would just laugh at me more." But I could see the war going on behind her eyes, The part of her that had been beaten down by days of humiliation, fighting against the part that still remembered who she used to be, who she still was underneath the tremor and the fear. What if we waited until later? I suggested. After dinner, when the common room is quieter. Just you and me like old times. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, she whispered, I used to know Chopin's Minute Waltz by heart. I played it for your mother when she was pregnant with you. I wonder if these old fingers would remember. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. It was possibility, fragile and tentative, but real nonetheless. We spent the rest of the afternoon in her room, looking through photo albums I had brought from home. Pictures of family gatherings, holidays, birthday parties, and in so many of them, there was Rose at the piano, her hands graceful and sure, her face radiant with joy. With each photograph, I could see her remembering not just the moments, but the music that had been the soundtrack to our family's life. As evening approached and dinner time arrived, I helped her to the dining room, staying close to deflect any comments from the staff. Todd was working the evening shift again, and I could see him watching us, probably hoping for another opportunity to showcase his casual cruelty. But something had changed in Rose during our afternoon together. Her back was a little straighter, her chin held a little higher. When she struggled to cut her meatloaf, she didn't hide her hands in shame. Instead, she looked at me and said, Would you mind helping me with this, sweetheart? These hands aren't cooperating today. It was a small thing, but it was acknowledgement without shame, assistance without defeat. Todd seemed disappointed that she wasn't providing him with entertainment, and he moved on to torment some other resident. After dinner, as promised, the common room began to empty. A few residents remained watching television, but most had retired to their rooms for the evening. The old upright piano sat in the corner, looking neglected and slightly out of tune, but still holding the promise of music within its yellowed keys. Rose stood in the doorway for a long time, just staring at it. I could practically hear the internal battle raging in her mind, fear versus longing, shame versus hope, the person she was now versus the person she had always been. Finally, she took a tentative step forward, then another, until she was standing in front of the piano bench. Her hands were shaking more than usual, probably from nerves, but she reached out and touched the fallboard that covered the keys. It's been so long, she whispered. What if I can't remember? What if my hands won't work? What if I make a fool of myself? Then you make a fool of yourself, I said gently. But what if you don't? What if the music is still there waiting for you? With tremendous effort, she lifted the fallboard, revealing the piano's keys, some ivory, some plastic replacements, all showing the wear of decades of use by nursing home residents and staff. She sat down on the bench, positioning her feet on the pedals, her hands hovering over the keyboard like birds afraid to land. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, carefully, she placed her trembling fingers on the keys and played a single, clear note. The sound hung in the air like a promise, and I saw tears spring to her eyes, not tears of sadness this time, but tears of recognition of coming home. That's when Todd chose to make his entrance, probably having noticed that we were still in the common room past visiting hours. He walked in with his characteristic swagger, ready to assert his authority, unaware that he was about to witness something that would change everything at Sunset Manor forever. Hey, what do you think you're doing? Todd's voice cut through the quiet of the common room like a knife through silk. He strode toward us with that familiar arrogance, his footsteps echoing off the linoleum floor. Visiting hours are over, and residents aren't supposed to be unsupervised in here. Rose's hands immediately lifted from the keys, as if they had been burned. The single note she had played seemed to hang in the air, a ghost of possibility that was being crushed before it could fully take shape. Her shoulders hunched inward, and I could see her retreating back into the shell of shame and fear that had been building around her all week. We were just leaving, I started to say, but Todd wasn't finished. And what were you thinking, trying to play the piano? He looked at Rose with undisguised disdain. Look at those hands shake. You'll probably damage the keys. This instrument has to last, and we can't have residents with motor control issues banging away on it. Motor control issues. As if my grandmother was nothing more than a collection of symptoms, a medical file with legs. I felt my temper flare, but before I could respond, something unexpected happened. I wasn't banging on anything, Rose said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She didn't look at Todd, but kept her eyes fixed on the piano keys. I was just remembering. Remembering what? How to make noise. Todd laughed, a harsh sound that carried no warmth. Listen, honey, I know this is hard to accept, but you need to face reality. You're not the person you used to be. Those days are over. Patricia appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. Behind her came Margaret and two other aides whose names I didn't know. They formed a little audience, and I could see the anticipation in their faces. They were expecting a show, another opportunity to witness an elderly resident being put in their place. But something strange was happening. Instead of shrinking further into herself, Rose was sitting up straighter. Her hands had stopped shaking quite as violently, and there was a look in her eyes I hadn't seen since before her diagnosis, a quiet determination that I remembered from my childhood, when she would face down bullies on the playground who had been picking on me. You know, she said, her voice growing stronger, I've been listening to people talk about what I can't do for weeks now. What I can't eat without spilling, what I can't write without making a mess, what I can't hold without dropping. She turned to look at Todd directly for the first time. But no one has asked me what I can do. Todd crossed his arms, clearly annoyed that she wasn't backing down as expected. Fine. What can you do? It was meant to be dismissive, rhetorical, a final crushing blow to whatever dignity she had left. But Rose smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from her since she arrived at Sunset Manor. I can remember every note of Chopin's Minute Waltz, she said simply. I can remember the way Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 16 feels under my fingers. I can remember Bach's Prelude in C major so clearly that I can hear it playing in my head right now. She turned back to the piano, and without asking permission, without hesitating, she placed her hands on the keys once more. This time, she didn't play just one note. She played a chord, rich and full and perfectly pitched, that filled the common room with unexpected beauty. These hands, she continued, beginning to play a simple melody that I recognized from my childhood, have played wedding marches and funeral hymns. They've accompanied church choirs and high school musicals. They've played lullabies for babies and love songs for newlyweds. The melody grew more complex, her fingers finding their way across the keys with increasing confidence. They've brought comfort to the grieving and joy to the celebrating. The staff members who had come to watch the show were no longer smirking. Patricia's mouth had fallen open slightly, and even Todd's arrogant expression was beginning to crack around the edges. The music Rose was playing wasn't perfect. There were a few missed notes, and her hands did shake, but it was unmistakably beautiful, filled with a lifetime of emotion and skill. These hands, Rose said, her voice becoming stronger as the music flowed through her, have held crying babies and dried countless tears. They've kneaded bread and planted flowers and written love letters. They've applauded graduations and held hands at hospital bedsides. She transitioned seamlessly into another piece, something classical that made the old upright piano sound like it was singing. A few of the residents, who had been watching television, turned their attention to the music, drawn by the unexpected concert happening in their usually quiet common room. Yes, they shake now, Rose admitted, her fingers dancing across the keys with a grace that seemed to transcend the physical limitations of her condition. Yes, they don't always obey me the way they used to. But they remember. They remember decades of music, decades of love, decades of creating beauty in this world. Todd tried one more time to reassert his authority. Okay, that's enough. It's past bedtime, and let her play. The voice came from behind us, and we all turned to see Frank making his way into the common room with his walker. Behind him came several other residentes, some in wheelchairs, others moving slowly with canes, all drawn by the sound of music that had been absent from Sunset Manor for far too long. Let her play, Frank repeated, settling into one of the armchairs with obvious satisfaction. It's been months since we've had real music in this place. Other residents began to gather, forming an impromptu audience. I saw faces that had been blank and lifeless during my previous visits suddenly animated with interest and pleasure. An elderly woman in a wheelchair was keeping time with her finger, and a man with an oxygen tank was humming along with the melody. Rose seemed to draw energy from their presence. Her back straightened even more, and her hands found the keys with increasing certainty. She began to play Chopin's Minute Waltz, the piece she had mentioned earlier, and the transformation was remarkable. This wasn't just an elderly woman with Parkinson's trying to relive past glory. This was a gifted musician rediscovering her voice, her purpose, her essence. The music filled the common room like light dispelling darkness. It bounced off the sterile walls and transformed the institutional space into something that felt, for the first time since I had entered Sunset Manor, like a home where people actually lived rather than just existed. I watched Todd's face throughout the performance, and I could see him struggling with what he was witnessing. This didn't fit his narrow definition of what a nursing home resident should be, especially one with a degenerative condition. Rose wasn't supposed to be capable of this level of beauty, this level of skill, this level of dignity. When she finished the Chopin, the residents burst into applause. Real applause, enthusiastic and heartfelt, the kind that comes from genuine appreciation rather than polite obligation. Rose's cheeks flushed pink, but this time with pleasure rather than embarrassment. "More!" called out a woman I hadn't seen before, probably in her 70s, wearing a bright purple sweater. "Do you know any Gershwin?" Rose's eyes lit up. "Do I know Gershwin? Honey, I grew up on Gershwin." She launched into Summertime, her voice joining the piano in a throaty alto that spoke of years of experience and heartbreak and joy all rolled together. By now, even more residents had made their way to the common room, some with the help of aides who seemed as mesmerized by the music as their charges. The sterile institutional atmosphere had been completely transformed into something warm and alive and human. Margaret, the aide who had called Rose dead weight just that morning, was standing in the doorway with tears in her eyes. I could see her grappling with the cognitive dissonance between the woman she had dismissed as worthless and the gifted musician who was filling their world with beauty. Todd, however, was not so easily swayed. As Rose finished Summertime, to another round of applause, he stepped forward again, his authority clearly threatened by this unexpected turn of events. "This is highly irregular," he announced loudly, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mrs. Mitchell needs to return to her room now. It's well past bedtime for residents, and this kind of performance is disruptive to the evening routine." The residents began to grumble and protest, clearly not ready for the music to end. Frank spoke up again, his voice carrying the weight of his years and the authority of someone who had probably run his own business or led his own teams in his younger days. "Son," he said to Todd, "I've been in this place for 2 years, and this is the first time I've felt alive since I walked through those doors. You want to talk about disruptive? Let me tell you what's disruptive treating people like they're already dead just because they're old and sick." Other residents voiced their agreement, and suddenly Todd was facing not just one elderly woman at a piano, but an entire community that had found its voice through her music. He looked around the room, clearly calculating whether this was a battle he could win, and apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. "Fine," he said curtly, "but don't expect this to become a regular thing. We have rules here and schedules to maintain." He stalked out of the room, followed by Patricia and the other aides, leaving Margaret behind. She approached Rose slowly, as if afraid that any sudden movement might break the spell that had transformed the evening. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said softly, "I owe you an apology. What I said earlier about you being dead weight, I was wrong. Completely wrong." Rose looked up at her with kindness in her eyes. "Apology accepted, dear. We all make mistakes when we don't understand each other." Margaret nodded, wiping at her eyes. Would you maybe play something else? Just one more song." Rose looked around the room at the faces of her fellow Residentes, people who, like her, had been written off by society, warehoused in this place and forgotten. People who had been reduced to their ailments and limitations rather than celebrated for their history and humanity. "What would you like to hear?" she asked. "Anything," called out the woman in purple. "Just keep the music coming." So Rose did. She played hymns that the residents remembered from childhood churches, jazz standards that reminded them of dancing with their spouses, classical pieces that spoke to the part of their souls that remained untouched by age and illness. With each song, the room grew more alive, more connected, more human. And her hands, those hands that had been mocked and dismissed as useless just hours before, created magic that reminded everyone present that there is always more to a person than what meets the eye, that dignity and worth cannot be measured by physical capability, and that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the hands that shake the most. As the evening wound down and residents began to make their way back to their rooms, each one stopped to thank Rose personally. They touched her hands, those same hands that had been ridiculed that morning, with reverence and gratitude. I helped her back to her room, and as we walked down the hallway, I could see that something fundamental had shifted. Her posture was different, her voice was stronger, her spirit had been rekindled. But more than that, the entire atmosphere of Sunset Manor had changed. Staff members nodded respectfully as we passed, and I could hear residents in their rooms humming the melodies she had played. "Thank you," Rose said to me as we reached her door, "for bringing me those photographs today, for reminding me who I used to be. But mostly, for believing that I could still be her." As I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had witnessed. My grandmother had done more than play piano that evening. She had reclaimed her identity, asserted her worth, and reminded everyone present that human dignity is not something that can be taken away by illness or age. It can only be surrendered, and Rose Mitchell had decided she was done surrendering. But I had no idea that her evening performance was just the beginning, and that by the next week, word of the piano lady at Sunset Manor would spread far beyond the walls of the nursing home, setting in motion events that would transform not just my grandmother's life, but the lives of everyone around her. The following Tuesday, I received a phone call that I never could have expected. It was Jessica from the front desk at Sunset Manor, but her usually cheerful tone had been replaced by something that sounded almost like awe. "You need to get down here," she said without preamble. "There are reporters here, and a woman from the Department of Health." And she paused, as if trying to process what she was seeing. "Someone from the Chicago Tribune wants to interview your grandmother." I nearly dropped my phone. "What? Why?" "Apparently someone filmed her playing piano Saturday night and posted it online. The video has gone viral. There are news vans in our parking lot." I grabbed my keys and drove to Sunset Manor faster than I probably should have, my mind racing with questions and concerns. How had a video ended up online? Who had filmed it? What did this mean for Rose, who was still adjusting to life in the nursing home and might be overwhelmed by sudden attention? The parking lot looked like a media circus. 3 news vans with satellite dishes dominated the space, and I could see reporters doing stand-up segments in front of the building. A small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered, and there were more cars than I had ever seen in that lot during my previous visits. Inside, the lobby was chaos. Reporters with cameras and notebooks were trying to interview residents. Staff members looked harried and unprepared for the attention, and somewhere in the middle of it all, I spotted a familiar figure in a purple sweater, the elderly woman who had requested Gershwin that Saturday night. "Excuse me, are you Rose Mitchell's granddaughter?" A woman with perfectly styled hair and a microphone approached me before I could even reach the front desk. "I'm Rebecca Chun from Channel 7 News. We'd love to get your reaction to your grandmother's incredible performance." I haven't even seen her yet," I stammered, trying to process the surreal situation. "I just got here." "Well, let me tell you, she's quite something. We've been here for 2 hours, and she's been playing piano for a steady stream of visitors. The other residents say it's the most excitement they've had here in years." I made my way through the crowd toward the common room, where I could hear the familiar sound of piano music. The song was one I didn't recognize, but it was being played with the same skill and passion I had witnessed Saturday night. As I got closer, I could hear voices singing along. The scene in the common room was unlike anything I had ever seen at Sunset Manor. Every chair was occupied, residents were gathered around the piano, and there were people I didn't recognize, visitors, family members of other residents, and what appeared to be staff from other nursing homes. In the center of it all was Rose, looking more alive and vibrant than I had seen her in months. She was playing Amazing Grace, and the entire room was singing along in a harmony that sent chills down my spine. Her hands were shaking as much as ever, but the music that flowed from them was pure and powerful, transforming the institutional common room into something that felt sacred. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous. I saw tears in the eyes of people I had never met, and I watched as a reporter wiped her eyes before quickly composing herself for her next question. "Mrs. Mitchell," called out a man with a professional camera, "could you tell us about living with Parkinson's disease and how music helps you cope?" Rose looked around the room, taking in the faces of her fellow residents, the staff members who had treated her so differently just days before, and the strangers who had come to witness something extraordinary. "Young man," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room despite her age, "Parkinson's doesn't define me any more than the color of my hair defines me. Yes, my hands shake. Yes, I struggle with things I used to do easily. But inside this aging body is the same person who has loved music her entire life. The same person who finds joy in bringing happiness to others." She gestured to the residents around her. "Look at these faces. These are people who have lived full, rich lives. They've raised families, built careers, served their communities, survived wars and loss and heartbreak. They have stories to tell, wisdom to share, love to give. Just because we're in a nursing home doesn't mean we've stopped being human beings with value and dignity." Frank, who had become something of Rose's champion since Saturday night, spoke up from his chair. "She's right. This place felt like a warehouse before Rose started playing. Now it feels like a community." I noticed Todd standing in the back of the room, looking uncomfortable with all the attention. The administrator of the facility, a middle-aged man I had met briefly during Rose's admission, was hovering near the reporters, clearly trying to put the best spin on the situation for his facility. "Sunset Manor has always believed in providing holistic care for our residents," he was saying to a reporter. "We encourage all forms of therapeutic activity, including music therapy." I almost laughed at the irony. Just days ago, his staff had been mocking Rose's condition and treating her like a burden. Now they were taking credit for her musical renaissance. A young woman with a notebook approached Rose. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Chicago Tribune. We understand that you faced some challenges when you first arrived here. Can you tell us about that?" Rose paused, her hands resting on the piano keys. I could see her weighing her words carefully, and I held my breath, wondering if she would expose the cruel treatment she had endured. "When you have a condition like Parkinson's," she said finally, "people sometimes see the symptoms before they see the person. They see the shaking hands, the slow movements, the difficulty with everyday tasks. What they don't see is that inside, you're still completely yourself. You still have thoughts, feelings, dreams, and abilities. The challenge is helping others recognize that your worth as a human being hasn't diminished." It was a graceful response that managed to address the issue without directly attacking anyone. But I noticed several staff members shifting uncomfortably, particularly Margaret, who had been forced to confront her own prejudices. "Can you play something for us now?" asked Rebecca Chun, positioning her cameraman for the best angle. "What would you like to hear?" Rose asked, and I marveled at how comfortable she seemed with all the attention. This was a far cry from the broken, defeated woman I had found in the dining room just days before. "How about that Chopin piece you played Saturday night?" suggested the woman in purple, whom I had learned was named Dorothy. "The one that made everyone cry." Rose smiled and positioned her hands over the keys. "This is Minute Waltz by Chopin," she announced. "It's one of my favorites because it reminds me that even when life moves fast and feels chaotic, there's always beauty to be found if you know where to look." As she began to play, the room fell silent except for the music. The reporters stopped scribbling in their notebooks, the cameras focused on her hands as they moved across the keys, and the residents leaned forward in their chairs, as if they were afraid of missing a single note. The piece was technically challenging, requiring rapid finger movements and precise timing. For someone with Parkinson's disease, it should have been impossible. But Rose played it beautifully, her muscle memory and decades of training overriding the limitations of her condition. Yes, there were moments when the tremor affected a note, but rather than detracting from the performance, it somehow made it more poignant, more human, more inspiring. When she finished, the silence lasted several seconds before erupting into applause. I saw the administrator wiping his eyes, and even Todd looked moved despite himself. "How long have you been playing piano?" asked Jennifer Walsh. 70 years, Rose replied without hesitation. "I started when I was 12. My mother saved for 2 years to buy me an old upright piano, and I practiced every day after school. Music has been my constant companion through everything life has thrown at me: marriage, motherhood, loss, joy, and now this. Do you have any advice for other people facing similar health challenges?" Rose thought for a moment, then looked directly into the nearest camera. Don't let anyone convince you that your value as a person is determined by what you can or cannot do physically. Don't let them warehouse your spirit along with your body. Find what brings you joy, what makes you feel alive, and hold on to it fiercely. And remember that every person you meet, whether they're young or old, healthy or sick, rich or poor, has something beautiful to offer the world if you take the time to see it. Over the next hour, Rose played requests from the audience, told stories about her musical career, and answered questions with the poise of someone who had been giving interviews her entire life. The transformation was complete. This was not a nursing home patient struggling with a degenerative disease, but a gifted musician sharing her art with an appreciative audience. As the media attention began to wind down, I noticed something remarkable happening around us. Other residents who had been dismissed as incapable or uninteresting were beginning to share their own stories. Frank mentioned that he had been a master carpenter and still carved wooden birds in his room. Dorothy revealed that she had been a teacher for 40 years and still tutored residents who wanted to improve their reading. Another man, wheelchair-bound and usually silent, began reciting poetry he had written about his experiences in the Korean War. The reporters, sensing more stories, began interviewing other residents. Suddenly, Sunset Manor wasn't just the place where the piano lady lived, it was a repository of human experience, wisdom, and talent that had been hiding in plain sight. I watched Todd observing all of this from the sidelines, and I could see the internal struggle playing out across his face. The residents he had dismissed as burdens were revealing themselves to be complex, interesting people with rich histories and ongoing relevance. The woman whose shaking hands he had mocked was being celebrated as an inspiration. As the day wore on, something even more unexpected happened. Families began arriving, not just to see Rose, but to visit their own relatives who were suddenly being seen in a new light. Adult children who had been visiting out of obligation began staying longer, asking questions about their parents' lives before the nursing home, listening to stories they had never heard before. The administrator pulled me aside at one point. "Your grandmother has done something remarkable here," he said. "Not just the piano playing, but she's changed the entire culture of this place. Residents are more engaged, families are visiting more, staff are treating everyone differently. We've had 3 other nursing homes call today asking about our music therapy program." I almost pointed out that they didn't have a music therapy program. They just had one remarkable woman who refused to be diminished by other people's limitations. But I held my tongue, figuring that if it resulted in better treatment for all the residents, the administrator could claim whatever credit he wanted. Late that afternoon, after most of the reporters had left, I found myself alone with Rose in her room. The walls that had seemed so bare and depressing just days before were now covered with cards and flowers from well-wishers, both local and from around the country. Her phone, a simple device I had gotten her to stay in touch, had been ringing constantly with calls from old friends who had seen the news coverage. "How do you feel about all this?" I asked, gesturing toward the evidence of her sudden fame. She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the parking lot where news vans had been parked just hours before. "Grateful," she said finally. "Not for the attention, but for the reminder that I still have something to offer. That my hands may shake, but my heart still beats strong. That age and illness don't have to mean the end of purpose. You've changed this place," I told her. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone here." "No, sweetheart," she corrected gently. "I just reminded everyone that we're all still here, still alive, still valuable. The change was always possible, it just needed someone to believe it could happen." That evening, Rose gave an impromptu concert for the residents and their families. The common room was packed beyond capacity, with people sitting on the floor and standing along the walls. She played everything from classical pieces to popular songs from different eras, creating a soundtrack that spanned generations and brought people together across age and cultural divides. But the most powerful moment came at the end, when she asked the entire audience to join her in singing, "We Shall Overcome." As dozens of voices joined together in that song of hope and perseverance, I looked around the room and saw something that had been missing from Sunset Manor since the day I first walked through its doors: dignity, community, and the recognition that every person in that room, regardless of age, health, or circumstances, was worthy of respect and love. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the incredible transformation I had witnessed. In less than a week, My grandmother had gone from being mocked for her shaking hands to being celebrated as an inspiration. But more importantly, she had reminded everyone around her that human worth is not measured by physical capability, that beauty and talent and wisdom don't disappear just because we age or become ill, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply refuse to accept other people's limitations on who we can be. The video that had started it all, filmed by Dorothy on her old smartphone and shared by her tech-savvy grandson, had been viewed over 1 million times by the end of the week. But the real impact wasn't measured in views or media coverage. It was measured in the way residents walked a little taller, families visited more often, and staff members began to see the people in their care as complex human beings rather than just collections of symptoms and needs. Rose continued to play piano every evening, and those concerts became the highlight of life at Sunset Manor. But more than that, she had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond the walls of one nursing home. Other facilities began implementing music programs, families started spending more quality time with elderly relatives, and a national conversation began about how we treat our aging population. My grandmother's shaking hands, once a source of shame and mockery, had become instruments of transformation, proving that sometimes our greatest weaknesses can become our most powerful strengths when we refuse to let them define our worth. And every time she sat down at that old piano, her trembling fingers dancing across the keys, she reminded everyone present that there is always music waiting to be made, beauty waiting to be shared, and dignity waiting to be reclaimed, no matter how much our hands might shake. The story of Rose Mitchell and her piano became a symbol of resilience, dignity, and the power of refusing to be diminished by circumstances beyond our control. But for me, it will always be the story of my grandmother, who taught me that the most beautiful music often comes from the most unexpected places, and that true strength is not the absence of trembling, but the courage to create beauty despite it.